Good morning. Welcome on in, people. How we doing? Now you see me. Now you don't. Haha, I'm just kidding. Fixing the mic, or fixing the camera a little bit. But what's going on, people? Today is our last day of new Unit 4 concepts, which is pretty cool. Alright, so, and then like I said, tomorrow is going to be a review day. So make sure you have your Unit 4 review completed before class, right? That way you can kind of self-assess and see where you're at. Because I'm going to go over all 4 of those FRQs on the Unit 4 review sheet. I'm probably going to go over the beginning part too because it's super important. So just know, Unit 4 review is going to be tomorrow, and today is the last day of Unit 4 concepts. We're going to be talking about the loanable funds market, which is a pretty important graph. You can definitely expect it as an FRQ item on the AP test, but I don't think it's all that complex. I think it's pretty easy generally for students to understand the loanable funds market. So we'll knock that out today. I'm going to do one FRQ for you guys on the document camera at the end because, again, it kind of combines a lot of the Unit 4 concepts together, and we're going to try to illustrate crowding out on the loanable funds market, right? It's an FRQ about crowding out using loanable funds, so that's kind of the game plan today. So a lot of agenda items for you guys over here, right? A lot of things that you need to be aware of, right? The first thing is, remember, the Unit 3 test retake has been available, right? So you have the opportunity, if you want to better your Unit 3 test and go on to go formative, find the Unit 3 test retake, try your best at it, right, and see how you do. But you don't have to do it, but, again, there's no punishment if you do it. I'm going to take the better of the 2 scores. You guys here? Where's everybody? Where are you guys? We're second hour. Did class start? Where are you guys? Anyway, that, and remember, your Unit 4 AP Classroom MCs are going to be also due. I don't really make a due date on it because, like, I'm bad at, like, checking that. Just kind of like I'm bad at checking problem sets. Yo, what's up, people? But I'm gonna open up the Unit 4 AP Classroom MCs today as well. Try your best on those. Again, those are generally a little bit tougher than my questions. They're worded kind of in a weird way sometimes, but that's what to expect on the AP test, right? So I want you guys exposed to those questions, and again, I don't really care if you get a lot of those wrong or right? Just try your best at it. I want you guys to see them. I just grade those on completion. And then, what else? Keep track of their problem sets. And that's pretty much it, right? Just make sure 4.6 is due. It's finished tonight. Submit that. Don't miss a little bit of points because it's late. And then, make sure that Unit 4 review is done before class tomorrow. Okay. All right, people, let's get to your attendance in the chat because you guys are all here now. All right, so your attendance in the chat is, what is your favorite color of Christmas lights, even if you don't celebrate Christmas? I know all of you guys don't celebrate Christmas, right? But, just driving around or whatever, right? You're going to see Christmas lights. What is your favorite color of Christmas lights? What is the favorite color of Christmas lights? I still haven't done my backyard yet. I've done my front yard. My front yard is white or gold. Right, whichever you want to say, right? But clear, right? Are they called clear sometimes? I don't know. But let's see some of the results here. Ooh, yeah, you guys definitely like your Christmas lighting, right? For sure. We got dark blue, blue. Blue is probably my favorite. I know it's my wife's favorite, and we don't have a lot of blue lights. I want to do the backyard blue, but we don't have a lot of blue lights, and I'm kind of cheap, and I don't really feel like buying some. Blue definitely, I think, is one of the most popular Christmas lights out there. So is white, or gold, or clear, whichever you want to call it. Red. Ooh, we got a lot of people who like red in the chat. I don't know if I have any red Christmas lights. Red would be pretty cool too. Light blue, red, blue, or yellow. Oops. Red, bright blue, white, blue, light blue, red. No one's saying green. No one likes green Christmas lights. Ooh, dark purple. That sounds pretty good. Purple Christmas lights sound pretty. Sound pretty. White, blue, yellow, or blue. White, but like the warm white. I know what you're talking about. Like a goldish, more like not as like LED, bright, right? gold, white, blue, or red. So not one person said green. Christmas lights. Can you believe that? What other colors you guys not even mention? Green. What about multi? None of you guys like multi? None of you guys like the multicolor Christmas lights? I think those are pretty as well. No? Interesting. All right, people. Make sure your attendance is in the chat, so I know you're not skipping out here and just joining in at 11:50. All right. All right, people. Let's get to the loanable funds market because I want to make sure you guys have a lot of time to do, the agenda items, right? Some of you guys need to finish 4.6. Some of you guys haven't started the Unit 4 review, and you're going to get another problem set today that's all about the loanable funds market. So it's starting to pile on a little bit, so I want to make sure you guys have ample time to do those things. But yeah, people, we're finishing up strong here. That is the game plan. All right, people. Unit 4, money, banking, and monetary policy. Let's wrap it up by talking about the loanable funds market. And the loanable funds market is pretty easy, right? Like I said, it's just quite simply the supply and demand for loans, right? That's all it is. The loanable funds market is the supply and demand for loans. The willingness and ability to give out loans to lend, right? And the willingness and ability to want to take out a loan to borrow. So it's not all that complex, and we'll go over the shifters here in a moment. But first, we need to know that the loanable funds market is going to be on the vertical. It's going to be labeled real interest rate, not nominal interest rate. Remember, the money market is going to be labeled nominal interest rate, like what is the current interest rate. The loanable funds market has to be labeled real interest rate because we know when people, lend and when people borrow, when they make those transactions, right, they really account for inflation, right? It says, is a real interest rate of 50% good or bad? Is a real interest rate of 50% good or bad? Well, 50% interest rate, that's going to be pretty bad for the borrower, right? It's a pretty high interest rate. It's a pretty high cost of borrowing for the borrower, but it's good for the lender, right? So it depends, right? A real interest rate depends. If it's high, it's good for the lender. If it's low, it's good for the borrower, obviously. But you can see why that if this was a nominal interest rate, we really wouldn't know if it's good or bad, right? Because we'd have to know what is the inflation rate, right? So we're always going to use real interest rates. Real interest rates is what we're going to look at when we're talking about the supply and demand for loans because, again, when lenders and borrowers get together, both parties, if they're being rational, right, are going to account for inflation when they're making that, transaction, I guess, if you will, right? So the loanable funds market is always going to be labeled real interest rates. What is the loanable funds market? Is the private sector supply and demand for loans. So we're talking about giving loans out, right, by banks, right? Private banks, willingness to give out loans, right? That's the idea. The loanable funds market is the private sector, supply and demand for loans. But, the government can borrow from private banks. People obviously borrow from private banks. Businesses obviously borrow from private banks. Everyone borrows from private banks, right? So that's what we're basically going to be graphing is the supply and demand for those loans at private banks. So again, real interest rate. All right. So we're going to notice that demand is obviously going to have an inverse relationship because we know that if interest rates are really, really high, those that demand loans, we're going to call those people borrowers, right? Borrowers do not want to take out a lot of loans when interest rates are high. And when interest rates decrease, right? Borrowers, the government, businesses, or people, right, demanding loans are going to be more willing to take out loans when interest rates decrease. So, clearly there's going to be an inverse relationship for the demand for loans, the willingness and ability to want to borrow, right, to take out loans. High rates, you don't want to take out loans. Low rates, you want to take out more loans. And then supply is going to be the opposite, right? Supply is going to be a direct relationship. Who supplies loans, right? Again, we call those people lenders, right? Lenders are going to be more willing to give out loans as interest rates increase, right? At low rates, lenders are not going to get a lot of, rate of return, right? Not a lot of, money back for giving out a loan. And there's risk, involved when you give someone a loan. If rates are low, they're not going to want to give out a lot of loans. And then when rates go up, it's a higher rate of return, right? More profit for the bank. Lenders are going to be more willing to give out loans as real interest rates increase. All right. All right, so the loanable funds market, again, is going to look something like this, right? Just, supply and demand. Supply goes up, demand goes down, and, I hope that makes sense, why demand slopes downward, right? Again, at high interest rates, the demand for loans is going to be very minimal. And as interest rates decrease, right, as we move down, the quantity of loans demanded would obviously increase, right? If interest rates are like 1 to 2%, real interest rates are 1 to 2%, I'm going to be definitely more likely to borrow than I would be, at 10%. Okay, and again, supply for loans is direct, right? As rates increase, banks are going to be more and more willing to lend out money because that's a higher rate of return, right? A higher profit margin, right? For giving out those loans. So that's all that is involved with the supply and demand or the loanable funds market. So what I always tell students and what I like to do myself is when I draw the loanable funds market, I like to write in lenders and I like to write in borrowers. For whatever reason, I think it helps myself out and it helps students out when you do so, right? Who is supplying loans? Lenders do, right? Who demands loans? Borrowers do, right? So when you read the scenario, you read the situation, right? Ask yourself, based on this, are people going to be more or less likely to want to borrow, or are banks going to have more or less of an ability to supply loans? I'll show you that here in a second, right? Is there going to be more or less money in the bank for banks to be able to give out, more or less loans? Is the easiest way to think about it. Okay? And then obviously, label your graph something, right? Unless stated otherwise, right? Make sure you're putting labels in your graph, right? An equilibrium rate, you can label that like IR or RE, right? It doesn't matter, or IRE rather. QE or QLE, right? Just make sure, when you shift this graph around, you have a clear starting point and you have a clear end point. And those that are reading your graph, right? If this is a free response question in May, right, and you submit it, right? You're using pencil, right, or actually you use pen on the AP free response test, right? The AP graders know which is your starting rate, which one's your end rate, right? Just make sure it's clear. Okay. All right. The loanable funds market. So what is going to shift demand? What is going to shift supply? The shifters of demand is going to be any change in perceived business opportunities, that revolves around, willingness and ability to borrow, right? So this one's pretty vague. It's just if businesses think the economy is going to be doing really well, right, in the next few years, they're probably going to be more likely to borrow, right? It's just business optimism, or even consumer optimism, right? Changes in perceived willingness and ability to borrow from consumers, right? If the economy is in a good spot and businesses know that a recession isn't around the corner, there's not going to be high unemployment around the corner, people are going to have the ability to buy their goods, they're going to be more likely to take out loans, right? They're going to be more likely to borrow. So that one's just pretty vague. Number 2 is changes in government borrowing. So we know that whenever the government uses fiscal policy, it's going to change their willingness and ability to borrow, right? They're either going to have to borrow more or borrow less in whenever we're using some sort of expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy, right? We've talked about when we use fiscal policy, it causes either a budget deficit or a budget surplus, right? So let's use a budget deficit for example here, right? Let's say the government increases government spending and doesn't change taxes, right? That would be a budget deficit. They're spending more than they're taking in via tax revenue. Or if the government, spends the same amount but lowers taxes, right? That also would increase a budget deficit, or they would be running a budget deficit. Or if they do both, right? If they lower taxes and increase government spending, they need to be even running a greater budget deficit, right? So if governments run a budget deficit, so you're going to have to read the question, right, and identify, is this a budget deficit or is this going to cause a budget surplus, right? Are they spending more than they're taking in via revenue, or are they taking in more revenue than they are spending, right? That'd be a surplus, right? But read that and then ask yourself, right, is the government going to have to borrow more or borrow less, right? So with a budget deficit, they're going to have to borrow more. You're going to shift the demand for loanable funds to the right. It's going to increase the demand for loans. The government's going to have to borrow if they're running a budget deficit, right? If they increase spending and they don't change taxes, right? Spending taxes, right? And we're going to spend more, we're not going to change the level of taxing, right? What's going to make up the difference? They're going to have to borrow money in order to spend more than they're taking in via tax revenue, right? So whenever the government runs a budget deficit, it's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. They're going to have to borrow more from the private sector. They're going to have to borrow more from private banks, right? Then we know a budget surplus would be, again, the opposite of that, right? The government's taxing more than they're spending, right? Again, so that'd be like they raise taxes and don't change spending, or they raise taxes and they lower government spending, or they keep taxes the same and they lower government spending, right? Now they can save money, right? Now they don't have to borrow money. They're going to borrow less money, right? Maybe they were borrowing money beforehand and they don't have to borrow as much. They're going to be less willing to borrow if they're running a budget surplus is the idea. So, expect the loanable funds market to be asked after a question involving fiscal policy. Because whenever we're using fiscal policy, it's going to run either a deficit or a surplus, and then obviously it's going to change the loanable funds market, right? So that's basically what changes demand. And then what changes supply, people, it's all about savings. If you see the word savings, it is going to be a supply shifter, because if people or businesses or the government or whoever, right, save more money, they're putting more money in the bank, banks have more money, thus they're going to be able to supply, they're going to be able to lend out more loans, right? So changes in private savings, that would be, referring to businesses, right? Businesses saving more money, right? So if businesses are not really taking out loans, right, and they're not really, spending their money, they're putting money into a bank account, right, to gain interest, right, they're saving money, that's going to have more money in banks. Banks are thus going to be able to supply more loans. Changes in household savings, right, me and you, right, just, everyday people, right, putting more money in the bank, in their savings account, that's going to have, banks are going to have more money, right, more excess reserves, thus they're going to be able to lend out more money. They're going to supply more loans, right? And then changes in public savings. This is the government, right? If the government chooses to save more money, so I'll talk about this on the next slide. This technically, right? Any change to fiscal policy, a deficit or surplus, actually could also change the supply for loanable funds, right? Because again, if you're running a budget surplus, that means you're saving more. Thus, it would increase the supply for loanable funds, but also it would decrease the demand for loanable funds. And then if you're running a budget deficit, it would increase the demand for loanable funds, while simultaneously also decreasing the supply for loanable funds. Because if you're running a budget deficit, you're going to be less willing, less likely to save money and put money away in banks. The government will, right? So private refers to businesses, household is people, right? Individuals, and public is the public sector, right? The government. But any increase in savings is going to increase the supply for loanable funds. Any decrease in savings is going to decrease the supply for loanable funds. It doesn't really matter who is saving, more or less, right? It's just more savings, more supply, less savings, less supply. And the last one is any change in, foreign savings, right, or inflows. We're going to talk about more of that in Unit 5, but that basically is if money is coming in to banks from other countries, right, more money in banks again, more supply for loans. So I put here in short, right, this is why generally the loanable funds market is easy for students to understand, because if there's any change to wanting to borrow, right, or increase in wanting to borrow, that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds, right, because demanding loans is borrowing, right? So again, read the scenario, right, the determinant, right, and ask yourself, right, are people going to be more willing to borrow? Is the government going to be more willing to borrow based on this? And you're going to increase the demand for loanable funds. If there's a decrease in the willingness or ability to want to borrow, that's going to decrease the demand for loanable funds. And then supply is all about savings, right? If there's an increase in savings, right, whoever's putting more money in the bank, banks are going to be able to give out more loans. If there's less savings, banks are not going to be able to give out as many loans as before. So, you're going to get a lot of practice with FRQs later today. I'm going to do one that is all about borrowing, right? You're going to see the demand for loanable funds change on the FRQ I'm going to do. And then all the other FRQs that I ever found about loanable funds market, most of them are changing savings, right? So you're going to change supply. You're going to figure out what happens to the real interest rate. And they're going to ask some sort of question that follows about like investment or like economic growth or something like that, right? Something that, when interest rates change, it's going to change something else, right? Maybe aggregate demand. But yeah, that's basically the loanable funds market, right, in a nutshell, right? If there's more borrowing, more demand, right? If there's less borrowing, less demand. If there's more savings, more supply. And if there's less savings, less supply. All right? Real quick, I want to talk about the concept of crowding out. We've talked about this when we talked about fiscal policy, problems with fiscal policy in Unit 3, right? Crowding out is whenever the government does something, and in doing so, they box out, they crowd out other people from doing economic activity, right? So again, I use the basketball analogy, right, of boxing out, right? Dwight Howard over here, boxing out, right? The government crowding out, the private sector, right, is the idea, or consumers from doing some sort of economic activity that they otherwise would have done. That is the problem with using monetary policy and fiscal policy. Sometimes crowding out can occur. The government does something, and in doing so, with the best of intentions to increase aggregate demand, what they're going to cause is some decrease in aggregate demand, right? So I'm going to show you that in the next slide. I forgot to mention this. I wanted to go to here real quick, right? Because I want to talk about this, right? Again, if fiscal policy happens, right, it's going to cause either a budget deficit or a budget surplus to occur, right? So again, a budget deficit or a budget surplus technically does shift either demand or supply, right? It shifts both of them. Now, if it doesn't say what happens to supply, assume it's going to be a demand shifter, right? That's what I want you guys to do, right? If it says, the government increases taxes without changing spending, or the government changes spending without changing taxes, what happens, right, in the ADS model, and what happens in the loanable funds market, right? Change the demand for loanable funds, unless it states what happens to supply. All right. If it states what happens to supply, then obviously change supply for loanable funds and think about it from an alternate perspective. But if unless stated otherwise, change demand. Okay. A lot of times though, either answer will be appropriate, right? The AP grader is going to say either an increase in supply works or an increase in demand works, right? And then, error carried forward, right, based on how you answer Part C on what you did to Part B, right, whatever happened to interest rate, is going to be error carried forward, right? So, again, when a budget deficit happens or a surplus happens, you can really change either or, as long as you like explain it, right? So again, when a budget deficit happens, it's going to cause the demand for loanable funds to increase, right? Because they're going to have to borrow more money, and if they're borrowing more money, they're going to be less willing to save, right? They're going to be saving less money, thus the supply would decrease, right? So if demand for loanable funds increases, supply for loanable funds would decrease based on a budget deficit, and a budget surplus would be, less demand for loans, and if we're running a surplus, we're saving more money, which would increase the supply for loanable funds, right? So, just think about the demand and supply for loanable funds, right? Based on if the government's running a deficit or a surplus. Are they going to borrow more? Or are they going to borrow less? And also, are they going to save more or save less based on that surplus or deficit? All right, so I'm going to show you crowding out on this here first, and then I'm going to show you an FRQ that was asked that basically you were illustrating the concept of crowding out. So here we go. We got a recessionary gap. It clearly is a recessionary gap. And how do I know that? Because I know that our actual GDP, right, YE is less than our potential GDP. So this is a recessionary gap, which means our actual unemployment rate is less than our net rate of unemployment. Or sorry, greater than. Our actual unemployment rate is greater than our net rate of unemployment. This is also called a negative output gap. Right? Again, just make sure you can draw recessionary, inflationary gap given different information. All right, so if we have a recessionary gap and we're talking about fiscal policy, what do we want to do? We want to either lower taxes or we want to increase government spending. Either of those two are going to increase aggregate demand, or we can do a combination of both of them, right? Increase government spending and lower taxes, right? Either way, if we use expansionary fiscal policy here to increase aggregate demand, right, and we calculate the tax multiplier or we calculate the spending multiplier, and we forecast that we are going to increase aggregate demand exactly, right? So our actual GDP is going to be equal to potential GDP to close the recessionary gap. Well, the problem is going to be this, right? When we use expansionary fiscal policies, because that's what we're doing here, right? In terms of the loanable funds market, right? Again, when we're running a budget deficit, because that's what's going on, if we lower taxes and don't change spending, or if we increase spending and don't change taxes, or if we increase spending and lower taxes, either way, whenever you're using expansionary fiscal policy, it's going to cause the demand for loans to increase, right? The demand for loanable funds will increase. So what happens is interest rates are going to increase, right? You can see that real interest rates are going to increase. So, again, the government's like, all right, let's use expansionary fiscal policy to close the gap. In order to do so, we're going to have to borrow money from private banks. When we borrow money from private banks, it's going to increase interest rates. And when interest rates increase, the quantity of investment will definitely decrease. And also the quantity of consumer spending will also decrease, right? People will be less willing to buy houses and buy cars. Businesses are going to be less willing to take out loans at higher rates, right? So they're going to invest less. They're going to buy less capital goods is the idea. So consumers and businesses are going to buy less things, and when they buy less things in the ADS model, right, it's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. So that's the idea of crowding out, right? We try to increase AD, but in doing so, we cause rates to go up, and when rates went up, it crowded out other people that otherwise would have invested, right? Businesses from investing, or people from buying houses or buying cars, right? Which is going to cause a fall in aggregate demand, right? So that's the idea of crowding out. So I'm going to show you an FRQ that was asked. It looks like this. Again, just because it's going to be really good graphing practice and all that, and we don't really do a lot of FRQs, unfortunately, right? Just because it's kind of hard to do online. So I want to do more FRQs for you guys. So let's do this one together. I know it's probably going to be kind of hard to see the FRQ here. You might have to maximize your YouTube screen. All right. So the first part says, assume that the United States economy is currently in long-run equilibrium, right, or at full employment. So I'm going to draw the ADS model at full employment, right? So I got price level, I got GDP real, right? And you can write GDPR, or you can write real GDP. Just make sure that you're telling people that it's real GDP, not nominal GDP. I got AD, I got AS, and our equilibrium is going to be labeled YE. And they want our price to be labeled PLE, which is good because that's how I usually label it anyway. But sometimes they ask you to label it in different ways. This ink is smearing everywhere. What is going on? And then I need to draw L or S, right? Because I need to show the economy at long-run equilibrium. So I usually label that actually YFE, but they said YE, so I'm going to keep it like that. All right, LRAS. So that is most definitely long-run equilibrium. Okay. B says assume that the government increases spending on national defense without raising taxes. So the government's going to spend more, and when they spend more, they're choosing also not to raise taxes. So that's obviously going to cause a budget deficit. They're spending more while taxing the same amount. So what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Aggregate demand would certainly increase. Aggregate demand would certainly increase. It's definitely going to go up. So I'm going to show that on my graph. That's 1 point. It doesn't say label it, but I'm going to still label other things. I'm going to label this Y1. And I'm going to label this PL1. And then it says, how will this government action affect the unemployment rate in the short run? I would write that unemployment would decrease because output increases. That's it. You just explain your macro relationships, right? You guys know that. You guys know that unemployment is determined by output, right? If output increases, we must be using more people to produce more output. So therefore, it's inversely related to unemployment. Unemployment rate has to fall if output increases, right? You guys can probably barely see this, but all right. C says, assuming that the economy adjusts to a new long-run equilibrium after the increase in government spending, how will the short aggregate supply curve in the new long run compare with that in the initial long-run equilibrium, right? So if we don't do anything, right? So now we're in an inflationary gap, right? So what do we do in an inflationary gap? We can either use contractionary fiscal policy, or you can use contractionary monetary policy to reduce AD and bring us back to long-run equilibrium. But in this case, it says we don't do anything, right? And the economy just adjusts by itself, right? Remember, that is changing aggregate supply. So that means aggregate supply is going to decrease. Aggregate supply is going to decrease, all right? So how will the short aggregate supply curve in the new long-run equilibrium compare with that to the initial long-run equilibrium, right? So AS1 is going to be greater than AS, right, at long-run equilibrium, right? So I would say, aggregate supply is going to be greater than, right, like higher up, greater than AS because it causes a decrease in supply, right? The willingness and ability to produce at all prices has decreased, right? They're going to produce less at higher prices. And the next it says, on your graph in part A, label the new equilibrium PL2. PL2. And this is kind of review, people. This has nothing to do with loanable funds yet. Until now. It says, in order to finance the increase in government spending on national defense from part B, right, the government borrows funds from the public, right? So they kind of give you it, right? Because again, it could be either or, right? Again, when the government runs a budget deficit, it could either increase supply or it's going to, it could decrease supply and increase demand, right? So it's either or. No matter what, though, right, it's going to increase that nominal interest rate. So D says draw the loanable funds market. Draw the loanable funds market. So real interest rates, and see how I was lazy. Don't do that, people. I'm just being lazy. Actually write it all out. If this is an FRQ on the AP test. Quantity of loans. Again, I'm going to be lazy. Demand. I like to write borrowers next to it. And supply, I like to write lenders. Because if not, people, it looks like just like a supply and demand in the product market situation. And then obviously the demand for loans is going to increase, which is going to cause an increase in interest rates like that. All right, and it doesn't say to label a specific way, so I'm not. This is going to cause rates to go up. And then part E is going to be, part E says, based on your change and we increase interest rates, right? We increase rates. What's going to happen to investment? Investment is going to decrease. And again, obviously, you're not going to draw arrows on the AP test, but I'm just doing it because I'm lazy again, for time's sake. And then if investment decreases, right, businesses are buying less capital goods, what's going to happen to the economic growth rate? That would also decrease, and you would explain it by saying, businesses are going to buy less capital goods, right? At higher interest rates, businesses are going to borrow less, right? So thus they're going to buy less capital goods. If they're buying less machines and tools and equipment than they used to, right, the rate at which we're going to grow, right, is going to decrease. We're not going to be able to, grow as quickly as we could because we're producing less capital goods than we did before, or we're using less capital goods than we did before. So hopefully that was somewhat a good review, a little bit from Unit 3's concepts, but also using the loanable funds market, all right? So I'll see you guys here in Google Meet here in a second. I give you guys a lot of time. It's pretty good. You got 27 minutes, and then also the 30 minutes afterwards, right? So we're going to complete, I don't even know how to load it up here. So we're going to complete the loanable funds market FRQs. There's 4 of them, but like when I say there's 4 FRQs, people, like I'm cutting them up from other FRQs. That's like, that's like just giving you like part D of this FRQ. That's what I'm basically doing on the other one. So that should not take you all that long, and then you'll have the rest of the hour to complete the Unit 4 review sheet. All right. So I'll see you guys in Google Meet.